This program was produced by Accuracy in Media, a media watchdog organization in Washington, D.C., representing the consumers of news.
This is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It was erected in 1982 to honor the courage, sacrifice, and devotion to duty and country of its Vietnam veterans. Like the war itself, though, this belated tribute to our Vietnam veterans has been the subject of bitter controversy, even though it was intended to help heal the wounds still festering from the only war our country's ever lost. Were the more than 58,000 men whose names are chiseled into this marble sent to die on a fool's errand with no purpose? Or even worse, did they die in a misguided effort to block the legitimate aspirations of the Vietnamese people for national unity, as many critics of the war contended? Or were they engaged in a noble cause, an effort to halt the spread of communist tyranny? These are the questions that inflamed debate in this country throughout the 1960s and 70s. They were reignited by a widely shown television series, Vietnam, a Television History, first aired by the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, in the fall of 1983. It's been widely used in classrooms and has been rebroadcast by PBS. Unfortunately, Vietnam, a Television History, was flawed by serious errors and distortions. I'm Charlton Heston. I've always believed you have to understand history so you can plan for the future. The philosopher George Santayana said those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This program is dedicated to setting the historical record straight by correcting some of the more serious errors of the PBS series on Vietnam. Many experts are convinced that that series, Vietnam, a Television History, presented a distorted and inaccurate view of what the war was about, how it was fought, and why we lost it. Douglas Pike, director of the Indochina Archive at the University of California at Berkeley, was a consultant to the project. He believes that PBS did not live up to its declared goals.
In order to get the money from the National Endowment of Humanities, the producers had to submit a proposal. It's a very thick, long thing. And in one section, it lists the purposes or the accomplishments or the results that they, in effect, are promising will come out of this. One of them is that it would be a contribution to the record, that it would supply information of a historical record. What we get then, in terms of record, is a kind of episodic series of images. Some are accurate, some are inaccurate, some are significant, some are trivial. It's just a kind of kaleidoscope of images. The second one was it would serve historical contribution as an antidote to the misuses of history. And I consider this rather laughable. What it does is contribute to the misuses of history. Certainly doesn't clarify them in any way. And the third promise made by the producers is that this would contribute to the healing of national esteem. And the notion is it would develop a kind of pride in America and help end the trauma of the Vietnam experience. And this is the most flagrant violation of all, because it simply doesn't do this. It does not produce anything on the screen that an American could be proud of. And the fourth promise that what this series would do would be to contribute to historical methodology, the method of writing history. And it certainly doesn't do that except in a negative sense as to how not to do it. I mean, this series is many things, but it is not history-telling.
In the summer of 1984, a group of Vietnam experts assembled in Washington, D.C. to examine the shortcomings of Vietnam, a Television History. In his opening remarks to the Washington Conference, Reed Irvine, chairman of Accuracy in Media, said the PBS series had at least been correct in portraying the tragic consequences of the communist victory in Indochina.
It tells us that in Cambodia, perhaps a third of the entire population of that country perished in the 3.5-year rule of the murderous Pol Pot. It tells us of the repression and misery that caused an estimated 2 million Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians to flee their countries at the risk of their lives, a tragic exodus unprecedented in the history of these lands.
Unfortunately, the PBS series doesn't show the connection between these horrendous events and their cause, namely the imposition of communist rule over all of Indochina. Now, there were people that were genuinely surprised when the communist Pol Pot took over Cambodia and began the extermination of all educated Cambodians. Even the New York Times ran a story on April 13, 1975, which was headlined, "Indochina Without Americans, for Most a Better Life." And that was datelined Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And I'm sure the author really believed that. But by the time the PBS series was made, there was no excuse for that kind of naivete. We already knew that Pol Pot and Ho Chi Minh had not been fighting for democracy and for freedom in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. But the producers of the PBS series went through the whole series as though they didn't know this, as though this was something that they discovered only when they came to the 13th program at the very end. Now, one of the great advantages of history is that you can take advantage of 20/20 hindsight. They didn't do that. They didn't write this series as though they had any understanding of what had happened until the very end program. And as a result, they failed to put across one of the most important lessons that should be learned from the Vietnam experience, and that is that the imposition of communist rule inevitably results in great human tragedy.
Stephen Morris is an Australian scholar with the Institute of East Asian Studies at the University of California in Berkeley. He says that the basic underlying myth of the PBS series is that the communists aren't really communists at all. They're just nationalists.
This is an important question, whether Ho Chi Minh was primarily a nationalist or primarily a communist. If he was primarily a communist, as I've argued, this means that he did constitute a security threat to the United States and the free world because of his commitment to the internationalist communist community led by the Soviet Union. The second reason is, if we recognize the fact that he was primarily a communist, we understand why his victory constituted a great setback for the cause of human rights in his own part of the world. Because as a communist, he felt it necessary to use massive violence against non-communists who might potentially threaten his power.
Dolph Droege was a member of the National Security Council from 1967 to 1973. During that time, he took part in a number of debates and teach-ins. He was appalled then, and he still is, by the general ignorance of Ho's dedication to the communist cause and his betrayal for profit of true Vietnamese nationalists.
In 1920, Ho Chi Minh, under the name then of Nguyen Quoc, found the path that he stayed faithful to for the rest of his life. He became a French communist, a founding or early member of the French Communist Party in 1920, and on a grant went to Moscow to study at the Toilers of the East School, the Lenin Institute in Moscow. There he became a Soviet citizen and took out a Soviet passport. He graduates from that school in 1926 and goes to China. He's on the staff of the Russian consulate, the Soviet consulate in Canton, China, and he works for Borodin, the famous consul. And he's an international communist organizer, and he brings Vietnamese to China to study revolution. And as they come to study, he supports them as long as he sees that they are open to a communist result of their studies. When they show that they'll cling to their nationalist beliefs, he then sees to it that they are betrayed to the French police back in Vietnam as they re-enter Vietnam. And so this trail even leads him in 1926 to invite his oldest teacher and counselor, the George Washington of the Vietnamese nationalist movement of those days, Phan Boi Chau. He invited Phan Boi Chau to Shanghai to talk about revolution, and he betrayed